A sharp wind howled through the streets of Paris, carrying with it a whisper of danger, a sense of something lurking just beyond sight. Beneath the towering iron frame of the Eiffel Tower, a man had vanished without a trace, swallowed by the very city that had once celebrated its own progress. As the mystery deepens, every step forward reveals only darker truths hidden beneath layers of steel and silence. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was on a damp and wind-bitten evening in the latter part of October that I found myself once more in the familiar confines of 221B Baker Street, the hearth aglow and the ticking of the long case clock marking a rare lull in our shared existence. Outside, the rain slid in slanted rivulets along the window panes, and the distant clip of hooves upon wet cobblestones lent a rhythm to the hush within. Holmes, curled in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, stared fixedly into the fire, an attitude which I had long come to associate with the silent formulation of theories that often led to the most extraordinary of revelations. For my part, I was content with the quiet. My journal lay untouched on the writing desk, and the Times, folded and damp from the post, rested unread by my elbow. Neither of us had spoken in some time, and neither felt the need. The stillness was broken at last by a firm knock upon the outer door, a brisk, deliberate rap that suggested neither hesitation nor familiarity. Mrs. Hudson, never long to answer, showed in a tall man wrapped in a travel-stained greatcoat, his boots slick with mud, and his features marked by a weary composure. He inclined his head stiffly, removing his hat with a hand gloved in fine leather. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a tone clipped by both accent and urgency, "I come to you from Paris with a matter of grave and perplexing consequence." Holmes did not rise, but his eyes lit with that peculiar gleam I had come to know as the herald of his professional interest. "Then you are very welcome, Inspector," he said. "Please come to the fire and allow us the courtesy of your name and your burden." "I am Jules Lemoine," the man replied, "of the Préfecture de Police." His voice, though calm, bore the tremor of something deeply unsettled. "You came by the early afternoon train from Dover," said Holmes, even before Lemoine had fully seated himself. "A rough crossing, though not enough to stain your cuffs, so you remained inside. Your valet is new and inattentive, which accounts for the light scuffing on the left heel of your boots." Lemoine's brow furrowed, his mouth parted slightly, but Holmes continued without pause. "You stopped briefly at Charing Cross to telegraph your arrival, but did not dine. The faint trace of coffee on your collar, burnt and bitter, suggests you took your refreshment on the boat rather than at the station." Lemoine blinked. Yes, that is correct." Holmes allowed a ghost of a smile to pass across his features. "Your profession is evident," he said, gesturing to the man's coat. "That bulge beneath your left breast is a holstered revolver, of French make, no doubt. Your cuffs are pressed with the regularity of a man in official service, and your stance is one accustomed to giving orders." "You are unnerving," Lemoine murmured, half in admiration. "Not at all," Holmes replied, waving the compliment aside. "Observation is the servant of deduction, and deduction is the handmaiden of reason. You are troubled, Inspector, not solely by the facts of your case, but by their implications, and if I am not mistaken, by the involvement of someone close to you." Lemoine's face tightened. "Monsieur Holmes," he said slowly, "you are more right than I care to admit." "I come not merely as a policeman," Lemoine continued, "but as a man caught between disbelief and desperation. A week past, my brother, Etienne Lemoine, a structural engineer of national repute, disappeared in broad daylight at the Eiffel Tower. Disappeared? I echoed. He was conducting a private inspection of the tower's second level. Several attendants and tourists observed him ascend via the north stair. He was seen speaking briefly to a technician. Then, nothing. He never descended. He did not leave by lift or stair. There was no scream, no sign of fall or struggle. It was as if the iron itself had swallowed him. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. And the tower was searched. Thoroughly. Every landing, stairwell, and maintenance shaft. No body, no clue. Only the echo of an absence that defies all sense. Holmes steepled his fingers once more. An engineer vanishes in the most public of places, without witness or trace. A singular conundrum. Lemoyne nodded gravely. And one the Parisian authorities dare not speak of openly. It threatens to become a scandal, or worse, a myth. It was then, in the stillness that followed, that Lemoyne's mask of professional detachment faltered. He turned his face toward the fire, and when he next spoke, it was with the softness of confession. Etienne is not simply a citizen of interest, he said. He is my brother, my only brother. A silence passed between us. Holmes said nothing, but his eyes took on a new weight, as if the scope of the case had subtly deepened. I did not believe him, Lemoyne continued. He said he feared something, beneath the tower, something unnatural. I dismissed it as overwork, as the paranoia of an aging man. His voice faltered. I was wrong. Few things cloud our judgment more than family, Holmes murmured at last, and few wrongs weigh more heavily upon the soul. Holmes rose at last, his eyes gleaming with cold clarity. You have come to the right place, Inspector, he said, for this is not a matter of mere disappearance. It is a matter of contradiction, and contradiction is the very root of truth. He turned to me. Pack a light bag, Watson. We leave for Paris on the morning steamer. Is it so urgent? I asked. He smiled faintly. When a man vanishes without exit, the clock begins to lie, and I have long known, my dear friend, that even steel casts shadows. Seated opposite Holmes, with the faint hiss of the hearth between us, Inspector Lemoyne had at last shed the composure of officialdom. His features, though carefully held, betrayed the gravity that bore down upon him. He spoke with deliberate restraint, each syllable tinged with a heaviness that no foreign accent could obscure. I must tell you, Monsieur Holmes, he said at length, that this matter is not one I bring to you solely as a man of the law. It is not merely professional, it is, to my shame, painfully personal. Holmes offered no interruption, only a slight inclination of the head which invited further speech. The man who has vanished, Etienne Lemoyne, is not a stranger to me. He is my brother, older by 6 years, an engineer of considerable brilliance, though solitary by temperament. He has lived most of his adult life in Paris and the provinces, consumed by his work, and estranged from society by choice more than necessity. There was a brief silence. I dismissed his fears, Dr. Watson, Lemoyne continued, now addressing me with eyes that carried the weight of regret. He said he was being watched. I told him it was nonsense. And now he is gone. Holmes, seated in his habitual manner with fingertips pressed together and gaze fixed, remained still as a statue while Lemoyne unfolded the strange sequence of events. 1 week ago, the inspector began, Etienne was scheduled to perform a structural inspection of the Eiffel Tower's second platform. He had recently submitted a request to the Tower Administration, an independent assessment, ostensibly to ensure the safety of certain rivet points on the northern frame. It was approved without objection, as his reputation granted him such liberties. And he was observed entering the tower? Holmes asked. Yes. Several eyewitnesses recall seeing him ascend the public stairwell around 10:30 in the morning. He spoke briefly with a foreman on the first platform, then continued upward. The technician he consulted states that Etienne was in good health and perfectly lucid. Was he alone? Holmes inquired, voice low but alert. Entirely. The upper platform was not open to tourists that day due to scheduled maintenance. Only a handful of staff were present, and none of them claimed to have seen him descend. By midday, when the lift operator inquired as to why no clearance had been issued for reopening, they realized Etienne had not been accounted for. Lemoyne's voice darkened. The entire tower was searched, stairwells, maintenance corridors, service shafts, no trace, no body, no blood. It was as if he had walked into air, and the air had closed behind him. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. Let us consider the mundane before the mysterious. What was the weather on that day? Lemoyne appeared unsurprised by the question. Dry, overcast, wind from the west, light enough not to disturb anything heavier than a leaflet. Were there any disturbances, sounds of alarm, panicked movement from the crowd? None. The crowd on the esplanade below noted nothing unusual. No scream, no falling object, not even a cry for help. And what of the attendants? Individually interviewed. Their posts are fixed and their numbers few. One, stationed at the south stairwell, reported an odd metallic clank just past 11, but he attributed it to construction tools left unsecured. Holmes closed his eyes momentarily. And no sign of forced entry or tampering with the structure. None that have yet been identified, said Lemoyne. But that is part of the enigma. If foul play was involved, it left no mark. If accident, it made no sound. And if choice, then one must ask, why such a vanishing act? And to what end? To this, Holmes made no reply. But the stillness of his expression told me the question was already unraveling in his mind. There is something more, Lemoyne said softly, as though reluctant to speak aloud what memory had been troubling him. Something I have not told the prefecture. Etienne, 2 weeks before his disappearance, came to my home. It was the first time in years he had done so unannounced. He paused. He was agitated, not outwardly hysterical, but disturbed. He said he believed he was being followed, not by any individual he could name, but by a presence, an intelligence he claimed moved unseen, yet with purpose. Holmes opened his eyes at that. I asked if he meant surveillance, political, perhaps. He replied, No, Jules, it is not what watches me that concerns me. It is what waits. Did he elaborate? Lemoyne's mouth tightened. Only this, that something had been buried in the steel long ago. Something he feared would soon awaken. I confess, I felt a shiver pass through me at the recollection. There was an unmistakable sincerity in Lemoyne's voice, a haunted quality I had seen before in soldiers who had come too near the edge of madness and returned with something broken inside. Holmes did not dismiss it. He merely said, Fear is often a signal, Inspector, not of ghosts, but of truth misfiled. Tell me, said Holmes, rising at last to retrieve a volume from our shelf on French engineering history. Your brother's professional background, prior to his civil appointments? Lemoyne nodded. He served the Ministry of Defense during the war. His skill in structural concealment, false walls, blind corridors, air shafts, was unparalleled. He was part of the Alpine installations in '79 and later attached to a design team for fortifications outside Verdun. Ah, Holmes murmured, a man whose talent lay not only in building structures, but in hiding within them. Exactly, said Lemoyne. After the war, he withdrew from military contracts. He grew quiet, even secretive. We assumed he was haunted by what he had seen. But I now wonder if he was troubled more by what he had made. Holmes placed the book gently on the table and folded his arms. Then we must consider the possibility, however remote, that your brother did not vanish in spite of the tower, but because of it. He may have built something there, something others now wish forgotten, or worse, repurposed. The implication hung in the air like a phantom. The tower, once a marvel, had perhaps become a vault, and Etienne, its forgotten key. "I must confess," Holmes said, pacing now with deliberate slowness, "this is not merely a matter of disappearance. It is a defiance of physics, of witness, and of logic, which is precisely why it appeals to me." I studied him, noting the subtle shift in his posture, the quickening of that ever-restless intellect. An engineer with knowledge of hidden compartments disappears within a structure he may have helped augment beneath the eyes of a city. No corpse, no noise, no exit. A vanishing not into fog or forest, but into iron. He turned to Lemoyne. "Inspector, we shall take the earliest steamer to Calais. I suggest you arrange discreet access to the tower's plans, and whatever your government may hold in classified reserve." Lemoyne inclined his head with weary gratitude. As Holmes turned to gather his travelling case, he paused and said almost to himself, "The Eiffel Tower may rise above the skyline, Watson, but sometimes what matters is not what stands above, but what lies below." We arrived in Paris beneath a low-hanging mist that clung to the Seine like breath upon a mirror. The city, for all its brilliance in the daylight, had taken on a mournful pallor that morning, and as our carriage passed through the boulevards toward the Champ de Mars, I could not help but feel the weight of something unsaid pressing upon the stones. Holmes sat beside me in silence, his hat tilted forward and his gaze turned outward, though I knew it was not the city he saw, but the structure that loomed above it. The Eiffel Tower rose from the fog like a god wrought in iron, a lattice of industry and ambition, beautiful in its design and yet oddly severe in the cold light. "Paris cloaks her secrets more gracefully than London," Holmes murmured at last. "But no veil, however artful, can conceal a vanishing in plain sight." I said nothing, for I too felt the strangeness of our task ahead. There was a tension in the air, not merely the expectation of revelation, but the vague and dreadful sense that whatever had happened here had not yet finished happening. It was Inspector Lemoyne himself who escorted us to the tower, where he had arranged for discreet access through the lower engineering entrance. I had visited the Eiffel Tower once before, during its inauguration a decade past, but its grandeur now struck me differently. No longer a monument to progress, it seemed a cipher, vast and unknowable. We began with the service attendants stationed near the first platform. Each gave the same account. Etienne Lemoyne had arrived punctually, greeted them with courteous brevity, and ascended the stairs alone. One worker, a wiry fellow with smoke-stained fingers, recalled a peculiar comment Etienne had made in passing. "If I am not back by noon, wait until dusk." "Did he return?" Holmes asked. "No, monsieur, and by dusk we had begun to search." A second attendant remembered a strange moment, no more than a few seconds, where a gust of wind had passed through the stairwell unusually forcefully, followed by a dull humming noise, like the soft grind of machinery under strain. Holmes's eyes flickered, though he offered no theory. We ascended slowly, pausing to examine handrails, bolts, and floor panels. The air grew colder as we climbed, not in temperature, but in feeling. Each footstep echoed louder. By the time we reached the second platform, I found myself unconsciously listening for something I could not name. Some sound or presence that might answer the silence Etienne had left behind. Holmes ran his fingers along a seam in the metal flooring, then knelt beside a cluster of bolts that appeared newly set. "Something was altered here," he murmured. "And very recently." We turned the corner toward the northern strut when Holmes abruptly halted, his head cocked to one side like a hound scenting in reverse. "There," he said quietly, indicating a portion of walling near the platform's far edge. That panel is not original. At first glance, the section he indicated seemed unremarkable. A vertical steel plate bolted in place like countless others across the tower's interior. But Holmes, ever attuned to detail, noted what escaped ordinary eyes. The rivets, he explained, are too new. Their iron is unweathered, and the fitting is uneven. See the margin along the base? A fraction too wide, suggesting haste, not precision. I examined it more closely and could not disagree. While the rest of the tower bore the uniform rust of age and exposure, this plate looked hastily affixed, its lower bolts tightened with a torque that had deformed the surrounding metal ever so slightly. Lemoyne joined us, and his face darkened. That section should lead to an old maintenance corridor, sealed since '93. Sealed, yes, Holmes said, but not abandoned. Whoever replaced this panel had reason to access what lies beyond. The question is whether they sought entrance or exit. His hand grazed the cool steel with unexpected gentleness, as though searching for a vibration or memory it might yet yield. We shall open it, but not yet, he added. First, we must understand why it was closed. Later that afternoon, with the aid of a tower engineer and 2 silent workmen, the panel was removed under Holmes's supervision. It came away not with resistance, but with a dull sigh, as though expelling a breath long held. Behind it lay a narrow shaft descending at a steep angle into the core of the structure. The air that issued forth was metallic, dry and faintly bitter, like the scent of iron warmed by friction. Holmes, lantern in hand, ventured part-way in, stooping beneath a rusted girder. I followed at a cautious pace. The shaft was scarcely wider than a coal chute and lined with the dust of disuse. Yet, here and there, faint traces betrayed recent passage. A scuff upon the edge, a twisted strand of fabric, and most notably, the greasy imprint of a palm pressed into the metal bracing near the lower rung. Left-handed, Holmes murmured. Medium height, industrial oil residue, not tower grade. This man had access to tools of a different sort. Etienne? I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. He simply stared into the dark passage. Possibly, he said at last, or someone who wished to follow him, unseen and unheard. He stepped back and replaced the lantern's shutter, plunging us into shadow, save for the pale sliver of daylight far above. It was Holmes's instinct, rather than any formal permission, that led us to a neglected corridor between 2 cross-bracings, just beneath the second platform. The air was staler there, and the iron bore a film of neglect, as though the tower itself had ceased to breathe in that narrow span. Holmes tapped the walls with the butt of his walking stick, his ear tilted to the vibrations. Presently, he stopped before a ventilation grate no broader than a hatbox lid and knelt to examine its edge. "Watson," he said quietly, "a man in distress does not shout when he fears his cries will hasten his doom, but he might, if time permitted, leave behind the seed of a trail." With deft fingers, he removed the loosened grate. Within the hollow was a narrow alcove coated in dust and rust, but wedged deep against the corner was a leather-bound volume, its binding stained with oil and damp. He opened it with great care. Inside, diagrams sketched in a precise yet hurried hand, geometrical notations, a cluster of arrows converging on a central shaft, and 3 words etched beneath them all in capital print: Souterrain. Deux. Silence. Souterrain? I repeated. Subterranean, Holmes translated. Deux is the second, and silence, he added, is what a man writes when noise means death. The notebook, he said, was not merely a clue, but a confession wrapped in geometry. We next made our way to the archive office of the Tower Administration, an unimposing annex stacked with ledgers, invoices, and engineering rosters dating back to the structure's infancy. Holmes, after a brief word with the custodian, requested the maintenance personnel logs from 3 years prior to the tower's public opening. "I find," he remarked to me, "that those who return unseen are often those believed long gone." The logbooks were faded, their ink dulled by time, but Holmes pored over them with a focus that brooked no distraction. It was in the record for April 1888 that he paused, his finger resting on a gouged indentation. One name, Louis Garnier, had been violently erased, not merely crossed out, but scored through with such force that the page beneath bore the imprint like a scar. "Dismissed," muttered the custodian behind us. Garnier was caught misappropriating tools and materials. So they said. Fired before the tower opened. Disappeared thereafter. But not erased, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. Only buried. He stared at the indentation a moment longer. A man removed with such fury may not have been a thief. He may have been a threat to something far larger than inventory. The tower, for all its grandeur, ran on mundane routines, waste disposal among them. It was Holmes's belief that secrets rarely hid in shadow, but in the margins others overlook. So it was that he descended into the rubbish cellars beneath the structure, a dim warren where refuse from tourists and staff alike collected. There, amid crumpled maps, cigarette stubs and torn pamphlets, Holmes extracted a folded slip bearing the official seal of the tower. It appeared to be a visitor's entry pass, except that the font was fractionally different, and the validation stamp had been reversed. A forgery, Holmes observed. Clever, but not perfect. Someone needed access to the upper levels, unnoticed. Later that afternoon, we mounted a service stair unused by the public, ascending until even the regular maintenance foot traffic gave way to rust. Along the railing of the fourth strut, Holmes paused and touched his finger to the balustrade. "Grease," he said, "but fresh, of a type used for industrial winches, not elevator cables." Lastly, in a maintenance chamber behind the east elevator shaft, Holmes requested that a janitor's locker, long disused and rusted shut, be forced open. Inside, a cluster of metal shavings, a wrench etched with non-standard measurements, and a scrap of blue fabric bearing an unfamiliar insignia. Someone, Holmes concluded, has been here not once, but often, and he left more behind than footprints. We found Monsieur François Delacroix in a modest flat above a tobacconist's shop near the Rue Claire, his once sharp gaze dulled by ink-stained fingers and the weight of unpaid deadlines. He greeted us with a mixture of suspicion and resignation, offering coffee that smelled of boiled ink and burnt chicory. "Yes, I knew Etienne," he said after Holmes showed his credentials. "He came to me with stories once, strange things about buried architecture and plans that never made it to blueprint." "And did he leave anything with you?" Holmes asked. Delacroix hesitated, then retrieved a stack of papers from a desk drawer. Beneath receipts and unanswered correspondence lay a single envelope addressed in Etienne's firm hand. Holmes opened it with care. Inside was a single page, densely packed with symbols, arrows, and slanted lines, nothing resembling conventional writing. "A code," Holmes murmured. "Too complex for substitution. This is structural, designed for a man who thinks in blueprints." "Why didn't you publish it?" I asked. Delacroix looked down. "Because I didn't understand it, and by the time I tried to ask him again, he was already gone." Holmes folded the letter with solemnity. "Then the message waits not for the public, but for someone who knows how to read the bones of buildings." That evening, as we made our way through the lamplit boulevards, I could not shake the sensation that we were no longer alone. At every corner, at every crossing, there seemed a figure that lingered too long, or a glint of eyes turned quickly away. Paris by night held a beauty entirely its own, but beneath it ran an undercurrent, an intangible dread that I had come to trust through long acquaintance with danger. I mentioned my unease to Holmes as we passed beneath a wrought-iron archway. "Yes," he said quietly. "I had noticed." "You expected this?" I asked. "I would have been disappointed otherwise." He said no more, and I did not press him. But I carried the weight of that silence with me back to our lodgings. Somewhere in that fog-wreathed city, a presence stirred, watching, waiting, and perhaps already knowing more than we dared to assume. We returned to Delacroix's lodgings the following morning, with the intention of pressing further into the origins of Etienne's cipher. The mist that had clung to Paris since our arrival had thickened, as though the city itself had secrets it could no longer restrain. The journalist's street was silent, too silent, and as we ascended the narrow stair, Holmes's hand moved instinctively to his walking stick. The door to Delacroix's rooms stood ajar, swaying faintly as if disturbed only moments before. Holmes did not knock. He pushed it open with a firm hand. The sight within froze me. Delacroix lay sprawled across the floor, limbs at disjointed angles, a glass bottle shattered beside him. His face was deathly pale, lips tinged an unnatural blue. The air was thick with a pungent sweetness I could not at first identify, but Holmes, stooping low, murmured at once, "Almonds, a mimic of nature's innocence, hiding death's breath, cyanogenic compounds, but not cyanide, something slower." I dropped to my knees, checking the man's pulse. "Faint," I said, "but present." Holmes was already examining the spilled bottle, his expression grim. "There is still time. Watson, summon the nearest physician. This man has been silenced, but not yet claimed." The doctor arrived within the hour, a wiry Parisian with trembling hands but a sound mind. Under Holmes's direction, he administered emetics and stimulants, stabilizing the journalist's failing breath. Holmes, meanwhile, studied the absinthe bottle with detached intensity. "Chloral hydrate," he pronounced, "a sedative of curious choice. It disables without killing, provided the dosage is cautious. This was not an execution, Watson. It was an interruption." As Delacroix was lifted to bed, Holmes moved with quiet purpose through the flat. Drawers stood partially open, one of them clearly rifled. A sheaf of documents had been spilled behind the desk, and the rug bore the trace of a heel pivoting sharply. "They searched," Holmes said, "but in haste. Not for valuables, but for silence. Whatever Delacroix knew, he has not yet said it." He paused beside the man's desk, touching the drawer we had opened only the day before. "Someone else has seen the letter," he said, "and they were not pleased." It was well past midnight when Holmes, seated cross-legged on the carpet of our rented lodgings, laid Etienne's cipher before him. A dozen sheets surrounded him, each bearing notes in Holmes's sharp script, translations, mirrorings, and numerical reductions. I sat in the armchair, heavy with fatigue, but unwilling to surrender to sleep. "Watson," he said at last, not looking up. Etienne encoded his message not with language, but with geometry. "Geometry?" "Precisely. The angles correspond to architectural signatures. Hidden cavities, double walls, shafts that should not exist." He laid the decoded letter before me. Etienne's words were spare but potent. "Shaft beneath tower. Forgotten but not lost. Conceals delivery of design to foreign hands. If I vanish, know. The silence is not absence, but warning. Some within still believe the old cause." Holmes leaned back. "The chamber exists, and it is not merely the tomb of secrets. It is a gate, one through which contraband, documents, perhaps even arms, pass unseen beneath the very heart of Paris." I stared at the letter with a growing chill. "And someone," Holmes added, "is willing to kill to keep it so." We found Lemoyne in a narrow corridor of the tower's administrative offices, hunched upon a bench, his face buried in his hands. He looked up at our approach, his expression drawn and colourless. "I was the last man he warned," he whispered, and I laughed. I said, "Ghosts do not nest in girders." Holmes stood silently nearby, offering no false assurance. Lemoyne's eyes met mine. "Do you think he is alive, Doctor?" I hesitated. "I think your brother was a man of remarkable foresight and strength. That counts for much in a world of shadows." Lemoyne gave a hollow laugh. I was too proud to listen, too sure I knew better. Holmes stepped forward then, placing a hand briefly on the inspector's shoulder. "Grief is an honest tutor, monsieur, but you still have time to answer it with action." Lemoyne nodded, though his gaze remained distant, as though already hearing echoes in the steel. We secured a meeting with Monsieur Delarue, the tower's chief administrator, that same day. A narrow-eyed man with a voice clipped by decades of bureaucracy, he received us with visible impatience. "There is no hidden chamber, Monsieur Holmes," he said with finality. "The tower is catalogued to the last bolt." Holmes did not flinch. Yet certain bolts have been replaced, records amended, and men struck from the roster. Baseless. Delarue stood. "You are a guest in our city, monsieur. I suggest you leave our shadows alone." "Are you threatening me, sir?" Holmes asked mildly. "I am warning you. France has no appetite for conspiracies buried beneath its monuments." Holmes rose. "Yet the monuments themselves often develop them, whether France approves or not." We departed in silence. Holmes's expression betrayed nothing, but I knew that, beneath it, his resolve had only sharpened. The National Military Archives, a fortress of silence and dust, granted Holmes rare access through a favour owed by a contact whose name I was never given. In a brittle folder dated 1887, we discovered the blueprints of early Eiffel Tower infrastructure, drawn not for tourists, but for contingencies of war. Etienne's signature appeared in the lower margin of several pages. "There," Holmes said, tapping a page with a gloved finger. "This shaft, listed as maintenance, but with double brackets and no counterbalance. It leads directly beneath the central support column." I leaned in. "But it's sealed." Holmes nodded. "Yes, and on purpose. A freight elevator, designed to move heavy cargo discreetly, its existence scrubbed from post-construction records." A notation in Etienne's hand read, "Réserve 2. Silence obligatoire." "Reserve 2, Holmes translated. "The second vault, and silence mandatory." He rolled up the blueprint with care. "We are no longer pursuing a disappearance," he said. "We are unearthing an intention." Word reached us via a contact in the gendarmerie. A suspected anarchist cell had resurfaced in Montreuil, rumoured to have schemed against the Eiffel Tower once before. Holmes and I attended a café where the group met in secrecy. The air was thick with smoke and murmurings in Slavic tongues. But as Holmes observed with increasing detachment, it became clear something was amiss. The men were too flamboyant, their stories rehearsed. A few bore grease paint behind their collars, and one dropped a theatre pass during an argument. Holmes rose, quietly amused. "Actors," he said, "paid to act the part of revolutionaries." "By whom?" I asked. "That," he said, "is the only line they forgot to rehearse." As we returned through the fog-laced streets, Holmes spoke at last. "Do you see it now, Watson? The lie wrapped in performance?" I nodded. "A misdirection." "Indeed, and not from amateurs. This deception was deliberate, calculated. The anarchists were a mask, placed precisely where I might find them." "Then the trail leads—" "Where?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "To the tower itself. Someone within. Someone who knows where the bodies are not buried, but hidden, and who fears most the light." It was a grey morning, and I awoke to the filtered light of a city reluctant to rise. The coals in our modest Parisian hearth had long since died, and the stillness of the room felt unnatural, as though something vital had been removed in the night. I sat up abruptly, for it was not simply absence I felt, but abandonment. Holmes's bed lay untouched since midnight. His travelling case remained, but the worn leather satchel in which he kept his more curious implements of detection was gone. On the desk, neatly centred, rested a sealed envelope bearing my name in his firm, angular script. I broke the seal with a trembling hand. "Watson, you must trust me now more than ever. Do not search, do not follow, do not involve the police. All will be clearer in time. S.H." There was no flourish, no sentiment, only command veiled in caution. I stared at the empty space where his shadow ought to have stretched across the carpet. For the first time in years, I felt not merely alone, but bereft of gravity, as though the force that anchored my purpose had quietly stepped from the earth beneath my feet. The letter burned in my coat pocket as I paced the room, its 12 words resounding louder than any scream. Do not follow. But how could I not? Holmes was not prone to romantic gestures, and his words held no theatre, only finality. Yet, in their sparseness, I heard something more chilling than concern. I heard calculation. He had chosen solitude as a strategy, but had not accounted for the helplessness it would seed in me. Every instinct I possessed, both as a doctor and a friend, rose in protest. Where had he gone? To what peril had he turned his face while shielding me with silence? I walked to the window and looked down upon the street. Paris went on, indifferent and alive, but somewhere beneath it, I felt certain a trap was being sprung, and Holmes had entered it willingly. It was just after midday when I received word from a concierge I scarcely remembered greeting. A note had arrived, unsigned, unmarked, but bearing handwriting I recognized as Inspector Lemoyne's. If silence is betrayal, then noise must be redemption. J. Holmes's warning still echoed in my conscience, but something in Jules's scrawl, its jagged edges, its refusal to conform, told me that guilt had overcome his patience. I hurried to the base of the tower, where one of the night guards, flushed with confusion, confirmed what I feared. Lemoyne had presented an old service pass and descended through a side entrance unescorted just before dawn. He seemed agitated, the guard muttered. Said it was a personal matter. He asked to be alone. I stared up at the vast frame of the tower, its iron bones rising like a sentinel blind to the struggles of men. A wind stirred its cables and groaned through its rivets. Holmes was already gone, and now Jules Lemoyne had followed him, perhaps into the very mouth of the design his brother had feared. What force had made them vanish, and what hand drew them downward with such relentless precision? By late afternoon, the news had spread through the engineering staff like ink through water. Another one, they said in hushed tones. Another man vanished into the steel. No one dared speak Lemoyne's name aloud, as though to do so might conjure the same fate. The guard who had admitted him now wrung his hands and spoke of hearing nothing, seeing no one return. He should have come back up, he said feebly. I checked the lower platform myself. There was no one. But I knew better. I knew the tower could keep its secrets not with noise, but with stillness. 2 men, each drawn by love and reason, had disappeared into a monument built for light, only to find darkness at its roots. The ache of impotence pressed hard upon my chest. I was losing them, one by one, into the very ribs of the Colossus, and I could not remain still a moment longer. I stood at the threshold of the local prefecture, my hand upon the brass door handle, when something arrested me, not from without, but within. A voice, not Holmes's, but my own, rose against the thought. He told you not to call them. Still, I turned back, not to obey blindly, but to search once more for meaning in his absence. Returning to our lodgings, I sat before Holmes's desk as the day faded, and in that deepening dusk, I noticed something peculiar. The edge of the drawer did not sit flush. I slid it open, and feeling along its inner edge, discovered a sliver of paper wedged behind the lining. It bore only a sketch. The tower's lower struts, an arrow pointing beneath the base, and a single word: descend. No signature, no plea, just direction. I stared at the drawing, heart pounding. Holmes had left no assurances, only the map of a decision. To follow it was to forsake the conventional, to step into danger without sanction. But what else was left to a man whose friends had vanished into silence? With steady fingers, I reached for my coat. With Holmes' note and my borrowed tower credentials, I made my way past the lower staff entrance under pretense of routine medical inspection. The guards, distracted by the hour's news, offered only perfunctory glances. I descended through an auxiliary lift, which rattled and groaned as it lowered me beyond the foundation girders, into a zone clearly not intended for civilian use. The air was colder here, with the sour tang of oxidized iron and damp stone. The space beneath the tower was no longer a blueprint, it was a breathing thing. The groans of the wind through its frame transformed into murmurs, as though the structure itself remembered every secret buried in its veins. I followed the crude map, moving past forgotten service passages and sealed bracings until I reached a corridor braced by ancient scaffolding. My lantern flickered, casting long shadows. My steps echoed louder now, as though I had left the known city behind and entered a separate realm, one built not to inspire awe, but to erase presence. And then, ahead, just faintly, I heard something not made by my own movement. A voice, or more precisely, voices. The air vibrated with something not quite sound, more an insinuation of voices born through ducts and steel. I pressed my ear to the iron, holding my breath. Not Garnier. Your secrets are not so deep as you believe. The voice was low, deliberate. Holmes. Another voice followed. Urgent, desperate. Then a third, cold and clipped, speaking in a tongue I could not place. The sounds ebbed and returned, distorted by metal and distance. But one thing was certain. Holmes was alive, and not alone. Whatever plot had driven men to vanish into the tower's bones was nearing its hour of reckoning. And I had arrived just in time. I crept through the iron passage until it opened suddenly into a vast subterranean chamber, whose ceiling arched with girders half swallowed in shadow. The faint yellow light of gas lamps flickered along the curved walls, illuminating tables strewn with blueprints, tools, and glass cylinders of noxious colour. There, at the far end, stood Holmes. He faced a man whose lean frame was draped in a mechanic's coat, blackened with oil and soot. His hair was streaked with grey, but his eyes, narrow and restless, shone with a manic light that startled me. Louis Garnier, Holmes said quietly, you wear death like a second skin. The man laughed, a sound like rusted hinges. You've always been dramatic, Holmes, but no less accurate. I thought you dead, Holmes continued. So did your employers, and yet here you are, beneath the most visible monument in Europe, conducting operations cloaked in silence. You call it death, Garnier spat. I call it resurrection. I remained hidden, heart thudding against my ribs, as Holmes stepped forward into the lion's den without a tremor in his voice. The air between them pulsed with unfinished history. I knew then that this was not merely an investigation, it was a reckoning. Garnier gestured broadly, a mad impresario presenting his theatre. Look around you, he said. Everything you see was built upon the bones of war, steel, secrecy, and vision. I simply continued what Etienne began. You corrupted what he designed, Holmes replied coldly. Not corrupted, completed. The tower was a signal, a symbol, but symbols are empty without force. What you see here, Holmes, is not madness, it is utility. A delivery system, a laboratory, a forge for the future. Banks of machinery hummed softly in the corners, masked behind sheeted partitions. Etched plates bore chemical symbols I did not recognize, and the acrid scent of volatile compounds hung thick upon the air. Holmes surveyed the chamber with a distant detachment. "You've built your empire beneath the very monument erected to progress," he said, "and yet you cling to shadows." Garnier sneered. "Progress is built in darkness, Holmes. The surface merely applauds it." In that moment, I understood the depth of Garnier's delusion. He was no mere fugitive. He was a man who believed himself the architect of a new world, hammering out revolution beneath the foundations of civilization itself. And Holmes had walked into it with eyes wide open. A low groan drew my attention to the far left corner of the chamber, where a cage of latticework steel had been bolted to the wall. Within it sat a man, emaciated but unmistakable, Etienne Lemoine. He looked up as Holmes approached, eyes blinking against the flickering light. His wrists bore the dark bruises of restraint, and a ledger lay open beside him, filled with complex schematics in a familiar hand. "Etienne," Holmes said gently. "It is over." The man gave a weak smile. "You found me, Jules?" "Alive," Holmes replied, "thanks to your courage." Garnier, undisturbed, watched us from across the chamber. He is an asset, a reluctant one, but a necessary part of the machine. Holmes said nothing, but I noted the tension in his jaw, the controlled fury of a man who would not permit his compassion to compromise his clarity. "You moved quickly after the Delacroix letter," Holmes said, turning to Garnier with casual precision. "Almost too quickly." Garnier's expression darkened. "You used the journalist as bait." "Of course," Holmes replied. "You were listening, watching. I fed you the fiction you wanted to believe, that anarchists were the threat, that the French state's enemies were moving openly." Garnier laughed bitterly, and Delacroix paid the price. "He lived," Holmes said sharply, "because I predicted you'd silence him through fear, not finality." I watched as Garnier's fingers curled into fists. "You led me here," he muttered. "I gave you the illusion of control," Holmes corrected. "You simply took it." The air between them thickened, not with bravado, but with the cold certainty that two predators now faced one another across a field of calculated risk. A new voice, languid and accented, cut through the tension like a stiletto. "Indeed, Monsieur Holmes, the illusion has served its purpose." From the gloom behind Garnier, a man emerged, tall, well-dressed, with the unbothered arrogance of a statesman unused to opposition. His ribboned lapel bore the insignia of a government post too high to be questioned easily. Holmes inclined his head. "Monsieur Vallin, you know me?" "I know ambition when it dresses in silk." Vallin smiled. "What you call conspiracy, I call foresight. France has grown soft under peace. The arms we build here are not for sale. They are insurance against England, against Germany, against decay." Garnier nodded as though in prayer. "I forged the steel. He grants it legitimacy." Vallin stepped forward, brushing dust from his sleeve. "You will not leave here, Holmes. You are clever, yes, but you are not indispensable." Holmes was silent, but I saw him shift his weight subtly, his hand brushing against his coat pocket. He had anticipated even this. Holmes turned his gaze toward me, not in alarm, but in unspoken instruction. My hand dropped instinctively to the head of my cane, the one he had pressed into my grasp before his disappearance. A moment's pressure on the carved inlay triggered a faint click, barely perceptible amid the hum of machinery. But deep within the tower, a relay would now fire, sending vibrations through hidden conduits to a bell mounted in the gendarmerie offices above. Holmes straightened. "You misjudged one thing, Valin." "And what is that?" the official asked coldly. "That while men like you conspire in vaults, the law listens. And today, it comes dressed not in robes, but in steel." The Frenchman's expression flickered. "Your words are dust." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but the echo they carry is heavier than you expect." Somewhere above us, though still distant, I fancied I heard the faint clang of boots upon iron. The sound of approaching footsteps was enough. Garnier's patience collapsed into violence. With a howl, he seized a revolver from beneath the table and trained it first upon Holmes, then upon Etienne. "None of you leave!" he shouted. "Not with what you know!" Holmes raised his hands, calm as ever. "And if we die, Louis?" "What then? You've burned your mask. The world is already watching." But I had not been idle. From my hidden vantage, I raised my service pistol, long unused, but familiar in weight. "Step away," I said, my voice steadier than I had imagined it would be. "You won't get a second warning." Garnier turned, surprise flaring across his face, just as I fired. The bullet struck low, enough to drop him without fatality. He fell with a cry and dropped the pistol, which Holmes swiftly kicked aside. Silence reclaimed the chamber. Holmes turned to me, expression unreadable, then simply said, "Well done, my dear Watson." Holmes, standing across from Garnier, exuded a quiet authority that could quell the most volatile of men. "Your plan, Louis, is as calculated as it is monstrous." Garnier's eyes flickered, though he quickly masked his surprise with a sneer. "You think too highly of yourself, Holmes. You don't understand the scale of what I've built." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, his voice firm, "I understand it perfectly. You needed Etienne's engineering mind to complete your weapon. Once it was finished, the man himself was surplus." Garnier shifted uncomfortably, but Holmes pressed on, his gaze never faltering. "Once you had the prototype, you planned to eliminate Etienne and seal the chamber beneath the tower, burying your operation and its secrets forever." For the first time, Garnier's facade of control cracked. He took a step toward Holmes, his fists clenched at his sides. "You know nothing of power, Holmes. You think you can stop this?" "I don't need to stop it," Holmes said, with a thin smile. "The law will see to that." Garnier's breath quickened, but it was clear. Holmes had already won this exchange. He had revealed the true depth of Garnier's treachery, and with it, the game was now afoot. Holmes's gaze shifted to me, and I knew, with an unsettling clarity, that this was the moment. He stepped back, his calm gaze never leaving Garnier's face. "You see, Louis, the truth has been recorded. Every word, every accusation. I did not move." But Holmes was already at my side, and with a swift motion he tapped the head of my cane. From beneath the polished wood, a small compartment clicked open, revealing a phonograph disc. It had been embedded there for days, carefully hidden from view. "The conversation has been captured," Holmes said, his voice low but resonant. "All of it. There is no escaping the proof." Garnier's face twisted in disbelief. You've recorded this?" "Indeed," Holmes replied with a slight nod. "Everything, right down to your confession." For a moment, Garnier stood frozen, his mind desperately calculating an escape route. But it was too late. The sound of the phonograph was already a death knell to his schemes. As the weight of Garnier's deception settled in, I turned away, feeling the oppressive silence of the chamber weigh down upon me. Then, a faint rustle reached my ears from the far corner. There, in the shadows, lay Inspector Jules Lemoine, injured, but very much alive. His eyes met mine, dull with pain, but gleaming with a flicker of recognition. "Jules," I said, rushing to his side. he managed a weary smile. "Watson, you found me." I helped him to his feet, steadying him as he winced at the pain from his shoulder. It had been a cruel thing to have left him abandoned in the darkness, and yet in that moment, the depths of his suffering were forgotten. And then, through the dim light, I saw him, Etienne, weak but conscious, stepping toward his brother. "Etienne," Jules murmured, his voice breaking as they embraced. The emotion in his words was palpable: regret, relief, and the unspoken weight of a bond forged by blood and hardship. In that brief moment, beneath the cold skeleton of the tower, I saw the heart of this case laid bare. Two brothers, lost and found in the very machinery of a dark conspiracy. The air seemed to freeze, as if the very walls of the tower held their breath. In the space between us, Garnier moved, swiftly, with the instinct of a cornered animal. His hand shot out, grasping for a blade concealed beneath his coat. With a roar, he lunged forward, the glint of steel catching the dim light. His aim was clear. Holmes stood directly in his path. Without thinking, I reacted. My hand found the revolver at my waist. In the same instant, I drew it and fired, quick, precise, and desperate. The shot rang out, harsh and sharp against the silence. Garnier staggered back, a cry escaping his lips, as the bullet found its mark in his shoulder. He dropped to the ground, the blade slipping from his hand. Holmes was unshaken. His eyes flicked to me for a fraction of a second, but there was no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgement. "Nicely done, Watson," he remarked with a cold clarity that left no room for emotion. I lowered the revolver, my heart still pounding. Garnier writhed on the floor, clutching his wound, but there was no escape now. The game was finished. The chamber fell into a heavy silence as the echo of the gunshot faded, leaving nothing but the soft hiss of the metal structures around us. Garnier lay on the cold floor, disarmed and restrained. His breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wild with the realization that his plans had unraveled beyond repair. Holmes moved forward with an efficiency that spoke volumes, tying Garnier securely, his every action calm, deliberate. And yet, beneath the cool exterior, I could sense the deep undercurrent of tension. There was no victory in this moment, only the quiet aftermath of violence and deception. The silence beneath the tower pressed in, as if the very monument itself had absorbed the weight of all the secrets it had guarded. The night was long, and our footsteps, as we made our way back to our humble lodgings on Rue de l'Université, seemed to echo through the quiet streets of Paris. There was little talk between Holmes and myself as we passed beneath the iron framework of the Eiffel Tower, whose looming presence cast a shadow upon the city, just as the events of the night had cast a shadow upon our minds. In silence, we entered the modest hotel where we had taken rooms, and the door closed behind us with a soft click, sealing us away from the rest of the world. Yet, even within the stillness of our room, the weight of the night's revelations seemed to cling to the air, much like the faint scent of smoke that lingered in the corners of the room. I sank into the armchair, weary, while Holmes, ever composed, sat with his usual air of quiet observation, though his eyes betrayed the gravity of his thoughts. It was in this subdued atmosphere that Holmes, after a pause, finally spoke. Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled before him, and I could see his mind was working tirelessly through the labyrinth of motives we had uncovered. His voice broke the silence, calm and measured, as he began to unravel the threads of the conspiracy we had witnessed. Garnier, you see, was not merely driven by a desire for power, Watson. His vengeance was far deeper, rooted in a twisted vision of retribution for perceived wrongs, real or imagined, against his ambitions. The weapons he sought to create were not for personal gain alone, but to fuel a vision of a new order, one built on the blood of those who stood in his way. I nodded. recalling the fervour with which Garnier had spoken of his designs. But Holmes was not yet finished. And then there was the official, the man of power, who saw in Garnier's scheme a means to further his own political ambitions. Greed, naturally, played a large part. Power, unlimited power through covert operations, was his prize. He would stop at nothing to see it realised. Holmes paused, his gaze intense as he met my eyes. It was a union of greed and vengeance, Watson, a dangerous concoction, and it was only through Etienne's unwillingness to bow to their twisted vision that he became a threat to them. Holmes's voice softened as he continued, the solemnity of his words hanging in the room. The tower, Watson, stands as a monument to human ingenuity and progress, a symbol of a future built upon the triumph of reason over ignorance. I nodded, recalling the awe with which the tower had first greeted us. It was a marvel of engineering, a structure that seemed to embody the spirit of its age. And yet, Holmes continued, in its very shadow, beneath its gleaming metal frame, secrets fester, secrets of power and destruction. What was once a beacon of light has now become a tomb of silence. It hides its darkness well. I glanced at the window, where the faint silhouette of the tower could still be seen against the Parisian skyline, its once proud structure now tainted by the weight of the conspiracy it had sheltered. The following day, after the authorities had taken charge of Garnier and his associates, I witnessed a quiet moment of reconciliation between the two brothers. Jules Lemoine, though still burdened by his guilt, approached Etienne with an air of quiet resolve. The scene was simple but powerful. Etienne, weakened from his ordeal but alive, looked at his brother with a mixture of relief and something more, something unspoken. Jules took Etienne's hand in his, and though no words were exchanged, the weight of the past few days hung between them like an unspoken vow. I stood in the background, a silent observer, recognizing the profound emotional complexity of the moment. There was gratitude, yes, gratitude for their lives being spared, but there was also an undercurrent of regret. The brothers had been driven apart by the shadows of ambition and duty, and it would take more than a shared moment of relief to heal the scars left by such a trial. The case, while concluded, brought with it no public celebration. The authorities, satisfied with the capture of Garnier and his associates, moved quickly to distance themselves from the murky details of the affair. There would be no accolades for Holmes, no grand speeches in the public square. As we prepared to leave Paris, Holmes declined all offers of recognition from the officials who had been involved in the investigation. His refusal, though polite, was resolute. "There are victories, Watson," he said as we made our way to the train station, "that are best left uncelebrated. The world is not yet ready for the full truths of this case. Some things are better hidden." I understood his words. The complexities of human nature, the greed, the pride, the betrayals, were not easily digestible for the public. Some victories, perhaps, should remain in the shadows, unspoken and unseen. We left Paris quietly, our train pulling away from the city just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the faintest traces of its light upon the clouds. The case was over, but its weight, like the shadows of the tower, would linger long after we had gone. The train from Paris to London was remarkably still, as though it too sought to distance itself from the tumultuous events we had just witnessed. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks became the sole sound within our compartment, a steady counterpoint to the quietude that enveloped us. Outside, the landscape blurred into darkness, the flickering lights of the stations we passed offering little more than brief interruptions to the vast expanse of night. Holmes, as always, sat with a quiet air of contemplation, his eyes distant, though his mind was undoubtedly working through the details of the case, even now. I, for my part, was lost in my own thoughts, gazing through the window at the fleeting shadows outside. The wind, ever so faintly, would whistle through the cracks in the glass, a sound almost too soft to notice, yet one that seemed to punctuate the silence with an uncanny presence. The journey, though uneventful, felt long, and the weight of the recent events lingered in my mind like the faint echo of a distant storm. As the train continued its journey, my thoughts often returned to the strange events beneath the Eiffel Tower. That majestic symbol of human progress and ingenuity, which had stood for years as a beacon of modernity, now seemed, in retrospect, a hollow monument. Beneath its towering frame, hidden from the eyes of the world, had been a network of secrets, dark, dangerous, and buried deep within the very bones of the city. The tower, once a triumph of engineering, had become a symbol of something far more sinister. What had once stood for enlightenment now stood as a facade, concealing the very shadows that threatened to undo the promise of progress. It was a sobering thought that even the greatest achievements of man could be built upon such foundations, hidden from public view, and, in the case of Garnier's machinations, bent to purposes far more nefarious than any could have imagined. The weight of this revelation sat heavily upon me, and I could not help but wonder what other monuments like the tower concealed their own dark truths. It was Holmes, breaking the silence, who at last gave voice to the thoughts we had both been mulling over. His voice was calm, even as it carried the sharpness of his intellect. "You see, Watson," he began, "the tower stands as a testament to man's ingenuity, but it also stands as a monument to his hubris. Ambition, when left unchecked, does not seek the betterment of mankind. It seeks dominion. And in the pursuit of power, the most exquisite of facades may conceal the most base of intentions." His words, delivered without flourish, struck me more deeply than I had anticipated. In them, I heard not only the cynicism that often marked Holmes's more critical moments, but also a reflection of the very nature of mankind, one that sought to reach higher, only to sometimes stumble into the very shadows it hoped to escape. "Indeed," Holmes continued, "our monuments may rise ever higher, but they will always cast a shadow beneath them." Holmes's remarks lingered in my mind long after he had ceased speaking. As I sat there in the quiet compartment, I reflected on his words, on the uncomfortable truth they contained. There are truths, after all, that mankind is unwilling to confront. For every advance we make, there are always the shadows lurking just behind, truths left deliberately buried for the comfort of nations and the preservation of social order. The tower, in all its grandeur, had been built to symbolize a bright future. Yet beneath its shining steel, hidden from the public eye, was a web of corruption, power, and betrayal. And how many other such monuments stood in the world, their true purposes obscured from the masses? How many truths had been buried for the sake of a more palatable, less disturbing narrative? It was a thought that troubled me deeply, for I knew in my heart that this was not an isolated incident. How often had the world chosen to ignore the darkness beneath the surface? As the train sped onward, I found my thoughts turning back to the case and the lessons it had imparted. Holmes had been right, of course. The truth of what had occurred beneath the Eiffel Tower was not merely a case of one man's ambition gone astray. It was a reflection of something far larger, a tendency within mankind to conceal its darker urges beneath the surface, to create facades that could hide the unspeakable. I could not help but feel a profound sense of unease. For what, after all, had we truly discovered in this case? The immediate threat had been quelled, but what about the deeper currents that ran through the events we had witnessed? How many times had such sinister designs gone unchecked, hidden in the shadows of the great monuments of the world? It was a sobering thought, one that I could not shake as I sat there, watching the landscape blur outside the window. The world, for all its grandeur, was full of secrets, And those secrets, like the darkness beneath the tower, would never fully be brought to light. I closed my notebook and looked out at the darkened sky, where the faintest traces of dawn were beginning to appear on the horizon. The case was closed, but the questions it raised would remain with me, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. And in the quiet, I could not escape the feeling that there were more such shadows waiting to be uncovered in the world. As the train rumbled steadily toward London, I sat in silence, my mind still consumed by the revelations of the past days. Holmes, however, remained unusually quiet, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. At length he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "The tower was built to rise above the city, Watson. Yet, even beneath such heights, man's darkness burrows deeper still." His words lingered in the air, a reminder of the shadows that lie beneath every monument of progress. What do you think drove Garnier's obsession? Was it merely power, or the desperation to bury a past that refused to stay hidden? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this tale of intrigue and deception, do subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries. Share this story with others and let us unravel the secrets of the past together.